here, open your Bibles to 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 1. And that is where we'll pick up in just a few minutes. We've been in a series over the past few weeks, and we're coming to the end of our series, The Big Story. We're retelling the big story of the Old Testament, one book at a time, or the past couple of weeks we've done 2 books at a time. The story of Scripture is a universal story. I mean, it narrows in to one family, one nation, but the beginning of the story is really important. The beginning of the story is about a God who creates the universe. And if the beginning of stories are important, then it tells us at the beginning of the story that this is not a story of a particular nation. It's a story of God. It's a story of a God who creates and then pursues humanity with his blessing. And no matter how much God pursues humanity, humanity again and again chooses death and not life, and chooses to spread the curse and not blessing. And so if the beginning of the story is important, then the end of the story is also important. And these books, Genesis through 2 Kings, hold together as something of a continuous story. And the end of 2 Kings is the end of that part of the story. And the problem with how the story ends here is that the people of God are defeated and they go into exile from the land in Babylon. Now that's a bad ending for a story. That's a bad ending for a movie. If you like movies that have happy endings, which I do, this is not that kind of movie, okay? This is not a happy ending when we get to 2 Kings. Now, we know that's not the end of the story. There's more that comes later. After exile, we find out some of what happens in exile in the book of Daniel, and then Ezra and Nehemiah, what happens after exile and all of that. But those books actually are placed at the very end of the Hebrew Bible. They're kind of separated, not in the English Bible, but in the Hebrew Bible, they're kind of separated from Genesis to 2 Kings. Those books, Genesis to 2 Kings, kind of hold together as a single story. They're shaped in a way so that 2 Kings is the last part of the story. And so you might wonder, why would you tell the story like that? Why would you shape the story that way? If you're telling the grand story of your people, you begin in creation and then you end with exile and defeat, how is that a good place to end? So we don't see it in our English Bibles, but immediately following the book of 2 Kings in the Hebrew Bible are the prophets. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the minor prophets, the 12 prophets. And the writings of the prophets come right on the heels of the defeat, right on the heels of the exile, to answer the question, why did this happen? Why? Why, in light of God's promise of land to Abraham? Why, in light of God's promise of an everlasting throne for David? Why does the throne end up being torn down and the people exiled from the land? Why does this happen? Is it because God failed? Is that why? Is it because God was unfaithful, didn't keep his promise? Did God fail in some way? And the answer is clear. No, God has not failed his people. His people, led by their kings, have failed their God. They have turned away. Now, if they turn back, Yahweh may lead his people back into the land once more. So the whole story, especially 1 and 2 Kings, shows the people why they ended up in exile in the first place, which also tells them a little bit about how they can return from exile. The basic idea of the book of Kings can be captured in this one statement in 2 Kings chapter 9, beginning in verse 6. I'll put it on the screen for you. So follow this. But if you and your descendants turn away from me, okay, this is about to happen. It's an if statement, but it's about to happen, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, this is what will happen. Then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them. So this is foreshadowing. They're going to be cut off from the land. This is why. The temple will become a heap of rubble, and then all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff. And they will say, what will they say? Well, they're going to ask a question. Why has Yahweh done such a thing to his land and this temple? And the people will answer, because they have forsaken Yahweh their God, who brought their ancestors out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them. So this is before all of this happens. And it is crystal clear why it is going to happen. Because the people have embraced other gods, worshiping and serving them. That is it. In a nutshell, this story is about good old-fashioned simple idolatry, worshiping and serving other gods. That's what 1st and 2nd Kings is all about. So let's begin. We'll kind of walk through this. Chapter 1 of 1 Kings picks up right after David is about to die. David's about to die, and so who's going to replace David as king? David was a great king, man after God's own heart, and one of his sons, Adonijah, is going to sit on the throne. He gets a kind of entourage of people, goes out, makes sacrifices, and has them all proclaim, Adonijah is king. Long live Adonijah. Well, the only problem is that David had made an oath to Bathsheba, and Solomon was supposed to be king, and if you know anything about kings and lines of succession, when one guy says, I'm the king, and another guy says, no, I'm the king, it gets really messy. Usually it gets really violent and bloody, and that is pretty much what happens here. In chapter 2, Solomon does become king, and David tells him, be strong, be courageous, observe what the Lord your God requires, walk in obedience to him, follow all his decrees and commands, do this and you will prosper in all you do. That's chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 there. So Solomon takes the throne, but the thing about Solomon is he's a really Jekyll and Hyde kind of figure. You never know who's going to show up, the good side of Solomon or kind of the dark underbelly, evil side of Solomon. And right off the bat, we see Solomon systematically, we see kind of the ruthless, violent side, because Solomon systematically eliminates Adonijah and all the others who supported him. Solomon wants total control, and so he kills all the people who are a threat to the security of his throne. And we can't help but remember how it was that David came to power. David didn't want to have anything to do. He refused to be involved in any kind of bloodshed when it came to killing those who were claimants to the throne. And it looks like, okay, things with Solomon are going to go a little bit differently than they did with David. Now, there's a good side to Solomon, and we usually think about this, Solomon's wisdom. Solomon wrote some of the Old Testament, Solomon in chapter 3, God says, Solomon, ask for whatever you want. And instead of asking for wealth or power, he asks for a discerning heart to govern God's people well. He asks for wisdom. Well, that's great. This is good. But then we're also told that one of the first things Solomon does is make an alliance with the king of Egypt by marrying his daughter, which meant that if you marry the daughter and she comes to live in Israel, then her gods come to live with her, and sacrifices to her gods start being included alongside sacrifices to Yahweh. That's probably not so good. And so we don't get any comment on any of this. The narrator is just telling us what is happening. And Solomon becomes extremely wealthy, extremely powerful. Massive military fortresses. He builds chariot cities. He's said to have 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen and 40,000 stalls of horses. That's a ton of horses. He built shrines and houses for hundreds of wives. So he has 1,000 wives and concubines, apparently. I mean, this is a huge royal family. And he builds governor's mansions and public buildings all over the empire. So it seems like Solomon is all about building the splendor of his own empire, his own dominion. How does he build all this? Well, he does it with slave labor. And this should ring a bell, okay? Slave labor, wait, hold on. Weren't there some stories in the Old Testament about some slaves who were building cities for a king? Oh yeah, I remember. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt building the cities of Pharaoh, and now Solomon starts to look so much like Pharaoh. He looks just like Pharaoh. Now the ones who were the slaves in Egypt are now the slave drivers, and they have their own slaves building the cities of Solomon. And it's like, this is not how Yahweh meant it to be. Now, among all the buildings, Solomon also builds the temple. That's in 1 Kings chapter 6. That's a bright spot for sure. That's where Yahweh is going to dwell, in Jerusalem. But he builds the temple with forced labor and heavy, heavy taxes. And he also builds the temple so that it kind of joins up next to his royal palace, the center of political power. So even the description of the two buildings, the temple and the palace, are side by side next to each other in 1 Kings 6 and 1 Kings 7. Listen to this. You just see what you think about, what the point is here. 1 Kings 6, verse 2 says, the temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 wide, and 30 high. I'll explain that in just a second. At the end of the chapter, it says, he had spent 7 years building it. That is, the temple. It took him 7 years. Next verse says it took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. Okay, there you go. He built the palace of the forest of Lebanon, and how big was it? 100 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high. So if you're not great at math, 7 years building the temple, 13 years building the palace. Okay, and the size of each building is given in cubits. And if you multiply those together, you get to feet, and 11,250 square feet for the palace, which is a pretty big palace, 11,000 square feet. And attached to the side of the giant palace was the temple, which, weighing in at about 2,700 square feet, is about a quarter of the size of the palace. Now, is that bad? We're not told. Is it bad? Is it good? The narrator doesn't say anything about that. He doesn't condemn Solomon. The story isn't condemning Solomon at this point. But you can't help but feel that the temple seems almost like an attachment to the giant royal palace, like an add-on. And one can't help but ask whether Solomon, in all of his power, has been tempted to think of God as domesticated and tamed to serve the interests of royal dominion. It all becomes a bit much. Solomon, his entourage of wives, and the demands for the daily furnishings of Solomon's household, because he's got all these dignitaries and wives and families and military generals that all live so extravagantly that to keep up the royal lifestyle, they required every single day 10 oxen, 20 cattle, hundreds of sheep and goats, along with several tons of flour every single day. And where did they get all that? Well, he divided the kingdom up into 12 districts, and each district supplied 1 month of the king's household provisions. And that's the way Solomon acquired these extravagant daily provisions, heavy taxation on the backs of the people. And the thing is, you read a lot of this, it's just about like Solomon's splendor and, how he's like a lot of the other kings in the area, and then other kings and queens come and see Solomon, and they're very impressed with all of this. And there's really no comment about whether this is good or bad or anything. But if you've been paying attention to the story so far, you start to get hints that, I don't know that all of these things are the way God intended it to be. Solomon was marrying wives from places that the law said not to marry. He's importing horses from Egypt. The law in Deuteronomy said not to do that. The law of Moses was concerned with distributing resources, dividing resources of the land fairly and equitably among all the 12 tribes. Like, there's very detailed allotments for which tribes get what and all of that. And they were supposed to look very different from all the other kingdoms of the world. And Solomon's kingdom doesn't look like that. Solomon's kingdom, it just feels like he is a lot like all the other kings of the world. In fact, he becomes compared more and more with all the other kings in the world. Like Solomon was more wealthy than all the other kings there were. And again, the narrator hasn't condemned any of this stuff yet until you get to chapter 11. And that's where the story takes a turn. And instead of telling us all about Solomon's splendor, we hear what the Lord thought about all of it. And it says in 1 Kings 11, verse 4, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. Verse 6, so Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He didn't follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech. Molech was the god who required child sacrifice, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. And the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Listen to this. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. The very first command. No other gods before me. Don't serve any other gods. Don't worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Broken. First command. And that is, in a nutshell, God's perspective and the perspective of all the prophets whose writings will fill out the rest of the Old Testament. The whole story about a king and all of his splendor, has more splendor than any other king in the earth. All of that He consolidates his own power through bloodshed and taxes and slave labor. It's all leading up to, this is all showing us his heart turned away to serve other gods. In so many ways, idolatry, we think about it like, okay, so what if he offers some sacrifices, da-da-da. No. Idolatry is bound up with all of this other stuff. Serving other gods, it's intermingled with all these other oppressive political systems and power-hungry kings and pleasure-seeking kings. Because the false gods were just made up gods. If a king gets to make up a god, a king gets to kind of decide what the rules are, and usually it's just all about the king gets to do whatever the king wants. These other gods were just invented to serve the needs of those in power. I mean, that's kind of the point. The stories of Solomon's extravagance, these stories, they show us where his heart is. His heart has turned away from God to false idols, which really just becomes self-seeking. We know his heart's turned away. Before we even hear the narrator tell us about this, we see it. And so goes the whole story of the kings of Israel. I mean, we kind of set up the story with Solomon, so we don't need to go into much detail with the rest of the kings, but it happens again and again. The kings turn to serve idols, but idolatry is never just bound up. It's not just a simple matter of failing to uphold some certain religious obligations. The stories of idolatry are told in terms of bloodshed and kings seeking power and seeking control and seeking their own comfort. Even the approval of other kings in the area. The kingdom is then torn from Solomon. There's a civil war. There's between the north and the south. There's lots of unrest. And in the middle of that, idolatry. So in the middle of all the war and all the bloodshed, like it's all mixed up with idolatry. Sir, you turned away from the Lord. This is what happens. Look. In fact, the very moment the kingdom is torn in two, idolatry is at the center of it. A king named Jeroboam makes 2 golden calves and says, "This is your God who brought you up out of Egypt." Now, if that rings a bell, there's a golden calf incident in Exodus with 1 golden calf, and they're doubling down on this golden calf thing. I don't think it's going to go very well. And the stories just get worse and worse. There'd be a king who begins his reign, and then he's killed by someone else, and there's, pleasure-seeking and bloodshed and violence, and then there's another king, kills off entire families of their opponents. I mean, it's just lust for power, and, the king is killed again, and so on and so forth. And at the center of all of it is just idolatry. Again and again, the point is they've turned away to serve other gods, and this is what that looks like. They're all connected. Service to other gods looks like this. The story makes it clear. Turning to serve idols basically looks like just turning to serve yourself. If an idol is really nothing, isn't that idol worship is just like self-worship? It's just self-seeking. Bloodshed is what it looks like to serve other gods because that's what it looks like when kings are out for their own power at all costs. Or pleasure-seeking is what it looks like to serve other gods because that's what it looks like to serve yourself. Now, the worst king of all of them is King Ahab. And there's a story of this guy named Naboth who has a vineyard. And he just, this vineyard has been in his family line since the days of Joshua. He's keeping this vineyard. It's his job to keep it and then pass it on to his descendants. This is a picture of old Israel, of the covenant of Yahweh, where everybody has the land given to them by Yahweh, and then they keep it, they tend it, they pass it on. Continuous family inheritance. But Ahab wants the vineyard. So Ahab kills the man in order to steal his land. And it's the ultimate assault on the covenant of Yahweh, taking by force what God had freely given to the people. And the summary that the story gives to all of this is that there was never anyone who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord like Ahab. Now, isn't that interesting? No one who sold themselves to do evil. No one had sold themselves more than Ahab. Isn't that an interesting phrase? Sold himself to do evil. You don't hear that very often. Sold himself. It means surrendered himself or handed himself over to do this. Now, how did he hand himself over? How did he sell himself to do evil? By going after idols like the Amorites who were in the land before him. So it ties the selling yourself to do evil to that's just chasing after other gods. They're all mixed up together. The picture is that if you're giving yourself away, selling yourself to things that are false, then this is the result. The reason the people are destroyed is not because God was unfaithful, The answer is clear. It's the people who've surrendered themselves to idols. Idolatry is the root. Now, the bloodshed is there. That's just like the symptom of it. And the violence is there, the way they seek pleasure. That's just kind of the branches. That's not the root. The root is you have turned away and you're serving another God. Serving self. The root is idolatry. The way they grab for power, that's just the branches. There are points at which it seems like everything might turn around. The prophets Elijah and Elisha are in this, and they're calling the people back, and maybe the people will turn around. You know, the prophets call them back to the covenant, and despite their efforts, despite the prophets giving warning after warning and chance after chance, the curse continues to spread, and the north and the south spiral out of control. The north is eventually conquered completely, and the south lasts a little bit longer, but then finally, they're surrounded. And at the very end, the second to last chapter, there's this summary over the whole thing. And it's 2 Kings 24, verse 20. It says this: "It was because of the Lord's anger that all this happened to Jerusalem and Judah. And in the end, he thrust them from his presence." He thrust them from his presence, literally from before his face. The Hebrew word is face. They are exiled not only from the land, but they are exiled from the face of the Lord, from the Lord's presence. This exile from God's presence at the end of the story harkens all the way back to the beginning of the story in Genesis, in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve hid amongst the trees of the garden. They hid from the face. They hid from the presence of the Lord in the garden after they had sinned. They were exiled from the garden, exiled from his presence. And then here we are again. We're here in the same spot, exiled again from God's presence. Why do we keep ending up here again and again? And the answer in 1st and 2nd Kings is that deep down at the root of all of this, why we end up exiled from God's presence, all the violence, selfishness, sin, evil, it's all turning away from God to sell ourselves to other things. The root of humanity's problem is idolatry. Now, my sense is that we don't typically think our main problem is idolatry because we're not making sacrifices to other gods or anything like that, in our backyard. And yet, at the root of all of our turning away from God is a turning to something else. Selling ourselves to something which is, to us, more valuable or more desirable, like power or comfort or control or approval. Down at the root, there seems to be 4 basic, deep root idols. Tim Keller talks about idols and counterfeit gods. There's also a book called No God But God by Dick Keyes, and he talks about these 4 root idols. The first idol is the idol of power. And the idol of power sounds like this. It sounds like life only has meaning. I only have worth if I have success, if I have influence, status, power, achievement. This is where your heart longs for recognition, longs to be admired, longs to gain status. You fear shame. You get angry when you are snubbed. The root idol there is power. The second is the idol of comfort. Life only has meaning. I only have worth if I have a certain quality of life or this kind of comfort or pleasure in my life. That's how I know that life is good. That's how, if I have these things. This is where your heart longs for maybe satisfaction or fulfillment, contentment, happiness, at all costs. You fear suffering. Anyone who gets in the way of your comfort or happiness is an obstacle. The root idol there is your own comfort. The third idol is the idol of control. This is a big one. Life only has meaning. I only have worth if I have certainty, if I have security in my life, control. This is where your heart longs for everything to go according to your plan. Because according to your plan, this will bring peace. This will bring security. You fear loss. And if I can control everything, I can prevent loss. The root idol is control. So you get angry when you can't control. The fourth idol is the idol of approval. Life only has meaning, and I only have worth if I'm loved, if I'm accepted by this person or these people. This is where your heart longs to be liked, longs to be wanted, desired, loved. You fear rejection. The root idol is approval. And it's easy for us to point at someone who, works too much and say, well, look at that, they work, they overwork, and they're worshiping their work. But it's not as simple as that. Down at the root of what's driving your life, what you're worshiping might not be work at all. It might be really the idol of power, the sense of achievement and success. You fear failure and the shame associated with it, so you overwork because this achievement is what gives your life meaning. But you might also overwork for a different reason. You might overwork because down at the root, what's driving your life and what you're worshiping is really comfort, a certain quality of life. You fear being deprived and not having what you need or want in the future, not having enough. And so you overwork because your idol is your own comfort. You've got to maintain a certain level or quality of life or whatever it is to have worth and meaning. This is how I know my life is good. If I can secure enough, I will have enough. I'll never fear suffering or doing without. Or it could be that you desire security and you worship control and certainty in life. If you fear loss and instability, you overwork. You work so you're trying to control your future and create security for yourself. Or you fear rejection. Maybe the idol is approval. And so work comes in with colleagues, or you want to impress a parent or a supervisor. You want the approval. You fear rejection, so you work harder and harder to get the approval. See, you won't be able to fix an over-attachment to work, so to speak, without addressing what's at the root of it. What's the root of your heart? What's your heart turn towards when it turns away from God? And the same goes with money and most other things. You think about, is money your idol, or is it really power? Like this is how you get status or, admiration of other people. Or are possessions your idol, or is it really approval from others? Is money your idol, or is it really certainty and security? And this is how you control, the future. Are possessions your idol, or is it really about your own comfort? Or think about your relationships with other people. Our idols typically draw in, consume kind of every area of our lives. Do relationships become more and more about your own recognition or gaining admiration from people? Or do the relationships become frustrating when they disrupt your sense or need for control or security? Do relationships become more and more about your need for approval? Or do relationships become frustrating when someone gets in the way of your own comfort? So be honest, this is hard, and no elbowing the person next to you either. What's going on at the root down in your heart? This is all of us, and it's really hard to face our own kind of idolatry. But here's why it's important. Every idol is false, tells us something false, makes a promise that it can't deliver. They all make false promises. If you worship approval, you'll never feel left out or rejected. Well, that's not true. If you worship comfort, you'll always have what you need, and you'll never suffer. No, it's not true. Or if you worship power, you'll always be admired, and you'll never feel shame. Nope, that's not true. If you worship approval or control, you'll have security. You'll never experience loss that you fear. No, that's not true. You might experience all of those things. Whether you're worshiping that, seeking self, seeking those things or not, you can't establish those things. Those idols make false promises. The truth is, you might experience rejection in your life. And Jesus says, yeah, that's a possibility. You might experience rejection from anyone else. But Jesus says, but I will never reject you. Jesus offers truth. You might experience shame, but Jesus says, I know your shame. I took your shame on myself. Come to me, I'll give you rest from that, from condemnation, from shame. You might suffer, but you'll never suffer alone, because Jesus says, I'll never leave you, I'll never forsake you. See, your life might spin out of control. You might lose control. You might actually lose the very thing or the very person that is most precious to you in your life. But in the midst of that, Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Jesus says, let go. Let go of the idols. They were never able to give you what they promised anyways. They'll only lead you into exile away from the one thing you needed all along and needed in the first place, which is the presence of God. That's why Jesus came, to reverse the exile. The exile from the garden, the exile from the land, to reconcile the world back to God. The end of the story is that despite all the times that God's people turned away from him, God never stopped looking for us. Jesus came to break the curse, to reverse the exile, to restore God's presence. So the very God who gave the command to worship and serve him alone, he came in the flesh to suffer the penalty for all the times humanity would break that command, for all of humanity's idolatry. And at the cross, as Jesus died, he made good on every single time that God had promised humanity, I will be with you. So what the cross is saying, I said I will be with you. Here it is. I will be with you. No more exile, no more separation from God's presence. I will be with you. Just the promise that no matter what, because of the cross, I came to be with you. I said I would be with you, and I will be with you. You will never be alone. And it's funny, if you go back all the way to the beginning of the story in the garden, you realize how profound it is that after all the striving and all of the things humanity is trying to secure their own blessing and all of these things that you see in the story of Israel and all the ways that people get it wrong, all we really want in the depths of our hearts we had in the garden at the very beginning. What we really want is to walk in the presence of God, experiencing his life and delighting in his blessing and his goodness and his approval and his love. That's why the psalmist says, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart, because the true desire of our hearts is to delight in God's approval, love, goodness, beauty, and truth. Trusting the gospel of Jesus Christ means letting go of all of the striving. Like you've tried, you've strived, you tried, but all of it was there in the garden. Just let go of the striving. Let go of trying to find all of the things that you think will satisfy. Letting go of those things which draws our hearts, like selfishness or control, comfort, search for recognition or approval. Trusting the gospel of Jesus Christ means dying to self. But then finding, when you let go, you're able to receive. You're able to find then all that we ever needed. He is inviting us into. Abide in his presence. Walk in his spirit. Receive his blessing, approval, love, forgiveness. The more and more that your heart rests in the love and grace of Jesus Christ, the more you can let go of seeking for yourself power or control or comfort or approval. You can let go of those things because you embrace with everything you have the gospel of Jesus Christ that says that Jesus Christ, by his death and with his resurrection, has secured for you all of the approval, all of the justification or righteousness, or all of the meaning and purpose and rescue that your heart longs for. All of those other things that we're longing for can be found nowhere else but in Jesus Christ. So whatever you're looking for significance, or whatever it is that you've been trusting in to make you happy, or whoever it is in your life that you've been depending on to give your life meaning or make your life worth living, look away from those things. Turn away from those things. Let go of trying to pursue those things. And look towards Jesus Christ. In the end, that's where the whole story is pointing. It's all pointing us to him. Let's pray.